cluttered home of Philo T. Farnsworth's widow, Pem, and two of her skeptical sons, the oldest, the aforementioned Philo T. Farnsworth III, born in 1929, and the youngest, Kent, who was roughly my age. Philo III, or P3 as he was often called, possessed unique insights into his father's legacy. But in those first encounters, it became readily apparent that the entire family, and Philo III in particular, were fervently protective of their father's legacy, and from the outset quite reluctant to discuss the fusion research, the star in a jar that consumed the final decades of their father's life. But over time, I would earn the family's trust and learn the truth underlying that apocryphal story. As we got to know and become more comfortable with each other, I finally got around to telling Philo the story that Johnny Videotape had told me, the story that he had heard from Phil Geetson, that Phil Geetson had supposedly heard from the lips of this very same Philo Farnsworth III. Philo chuckled. The story, he said, was indeed apocryphal and perhaps a bit broadly drawn. The details were well off. Philo III was hardly a child. He was already in his mid-30s during the years when his father was experimenting with fusion. But he also confirmed its essence when he said simply that the patents are incomplete. Think of a patent as a textbook. A well-written patent should instruct somebody skilled in the underlying arts how to build the novel device disclosed therein. But if crucial details are left out of the patent, then even the most skilled practitioner will be building a device that falls short of its intended purpose. In other words, filing an incomplete patent is much like taking a critical piece out of the machine and placing it on a high shelf where nobody will ever find it. Philo first told me about those incomplete patents sometime in the mid-1970s, but it was another 15 years before Pem Farnsworth, who had been at her husband's side during all the important moments in his career, would confide in me the story that is the climax of his biography. In the summer of 1989, I returned to Salt Lake to help Pem and youngest son Kent put the finishing touches on the memoir that Pem had begun writing when I first met her in 1975. And when we got to the second chapter, the decade devoted to fusion energy research, Kent and I could both tell that Pem was withholding something, a very critical detail that she was reluctant to divulge. Finally, we sat Pem down with a cassette recorder and coaxed from her the story of a night in 1965 when Philo brought her back to his laboratory that was, in fact, in a basement in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Once past the night watchman and settled in behind the controls, Farnsworth opened the electric circuits feeding the reactor and adjusted the controls. And then the strangest thing happened. He withdrew the electrical current, and the reaction just kept on going. Pem and Philo watched as the needles in various gauges pinned at the limits. And when the needles finally settled down, Pem told us that her husband turned to her and said, "I have seen all I need to see." Weeks later, he filed the patents that his son described to me as incomplete. It is quite common when reading of contemporary fusion research to encounter the skeptical caveat that fusion power is 20 years in the future and always will be. But I have met the family of Philo T. Farnsworth. I have looked them all in the eye, and I have seen and felt the abiding reverence they hold for the legacy they are protecting and the secrets that Philo T. Farnsworth took to his grave. And I share their conviction that fusion energy is not 20 years in the future and always will be, but its discovery was 50 years in the past, and we missed it. Thank you.